September 28, 1987, Goiânia, Brazil. At a government hospital in Goiânia, a woman walked in carrying a sack in her hands. Without a word, she slammed it angrily onto the doctor's desk. The doctor frowned and said, "What kind of rudeness is this?" The woman shot back, "There's something in this sack that is killing my entire family. Look for yourself." The doctor, in his mind, dismissed her as just another crazy person. But he had no idea that what lay inside that sack wasn't just killing her family. It was about to open the gates of hell for the entire city. And now, those very gates of hell were sitting right on his desk. Before we go any further, let me make something clear. This story has nothing to do with the Cobalt-60 radiation incident that once shook Delhi. Yes, it's true. Compared to what happened here, the Delhi incident is like an ant, because this isn't just an incident that drains you from the inside. It's the kind of story that will leave you in shock for weeks. Today, we're talking about one of the most dangerous and unforgettable disasters in history: the Goiânia accident. Back in 1985, a private radiotherapy clinic in Goiânia was scheduled to move into a new building. The old facility was supposed to be demolished, but at the last moment, a legal dispute delayed the demolition. As a result, some of the medical equipment was left behind, untouched for years. Time passed. The abandoned building slowly fell into ruin. Then one day, it caught the attention of a pair of thieves. September 10th, 1987, two men, Wagner Pereira and Roberto Alves, broke into the crumbling structure. Inside, they found what looked like a jackpot, an expensive-looking medical device. They had no idea what it actually was. To them, it was just a valuable piece of machinery. They decided to steal it. But the machine was huge and heavy. There was no way they could carry it all at once. So they removed the most expensive-looking part from the device and took it to Alves's house. The plan was simple: dismantle the stolen parrot and sell it for scrap. But before they could act on that plan, both men fell desperately, violently ill. At first, they thought they had simply eaten something bad, but what was about to happen, neither of them could have imagined. Wagner Pereira's condition began to worsen rapidly. A strange rash appeared on the palm of his hand. It looked almost like a burn mark. When he went to see a doctor, he was told it was probably just an allergic reaction. "Get some bed rest," the doctor said. "You'll be fine in a few days." Meanwhile, Roberto Alves was working tirelessly to dismantle the device. But taking it apart was no easy task. After 3 full days of effort, Alves finally managed to open it. Inside, just as he had hoped, he found valuable scrap metal. But one thing drew his attention more than anything else: an aluminum cylinder positioned right at the center of the device. The cylinder had a small glass window. Alves took a screwdriver and broke the glass window of the aluminum cylinder. Inside, he found something that looked like grains of rice. The moment he touched them, they crumbled into powder, a fine dust that drifted into the air. He had no idea what it was, no clue that this very powder would soon bring disaster upon Goiânia, a catastrophe that would tear through the city, bringing down more than 70 buildings as if they were made of paper. What Alves had unknowingly released was death itself. Alves had no idea what it was, but as far as he was concerned, it was worthless. So he took the cylinder and the other machine parts to a scrapyard, selling them to a scrap dealer named Ferreira. Ferreira stored the items in his garage. But that night, as he made his rounds through the scrapyard, something caught his eye. The very scrap he had bought that morning. It was glowing. A soft blue light was escaping from it, spilling into the darkness of the garage. It seemed to beckon him closer. Drawn toward it, Ferreira peered inside and saw the light was coming from a chalk-like substance housed within the aluminum can. Ferreira was an expert in scrap materials. Ferreira had never seen anything like that glowing powder in his life. He assumed it must be crushed gemstone, something rare and valuable. For the next 3 days, he invited family and relatives over, proudly showing off this miracle substance. Not only that, he began handing out small portions of the powder to them. One of those relatives was a man named Ivo Ferreira. Ivo took some of the mysterious powder home, thinking his baby daughter would love it. And just as he imagined, she was fascinated. The little girl began playing with it, smearing the powder on her hands and face. Soon, her entire face glowed like a night lamp. But the fun didn't last long. Only minutes after putting the powder on her skin, the young girl began to vomit violently. And then came the most shocking part. Even her vomit glowed with the same eerie blue light. Meanwhile, the scrapyard owner's wife, Maria Ferreira, had also fallen gravely ill. Severe vomiting, relentless diarrhea. When she went to a local hospital, the doctor dismissed it as an allergic reaction. "Get some rest," he said. "You'll be fine in a few days." That same night, Ferreira himself became violently sick. But despite his condition, he continued working. He had his workers break down the parts he'd bought from the feeds, keeping what he thought was useful, and selling the rest to other scrap dealers. And so the machine and its deadly powder began spreading across the entire city of Goiânia. Some of its parts even traveled beyond the city limits. While most people believed they were simply suffering from food poisoning, Maria began to piece the truth together. She remembered something. Ever since they had brought that powder and scrap to their relatives, all of us have fallen sick. This junk must be the root of it all. Maria wasn't highly educated, but when the doctor told her it was just a simple allergy, she didn't stay quiet. Something deep inside told her. Ever since that powder entered their home, she and her relatives had been getting sick because they had all touched it. Maria could no longer sit idle. She told one of her workers to pick up the sack containing the parts and the powder. Then, boarding a crowded bus, they made their way to the Goiânia District Hospital. Inside the doctor's office, she slammed the sack onto his desk and shouted, "I don't have any damn allergy. This is the thing that's killing my whole family and our relatives too." The doctor stared at her, stunned. He began asking questions. How many people has this made sick? Where did it come from? The doctor suspected it might be some kind of tropical disease, perhaps dengue or chikungunya. So he sent Maria to the nearest tropical disease clinic. But after she left, something about the situation gnawed at him. A strange unease settled in, and he began coughing. Not wanting to take any chances, he carried the sack of scrap outside and placed it on a broken chair. Then, driven by fear, he picked up the phone and called the higher authorities to report it. Meanwhile, Maria and her worker arrived at the tropical disease clinic. There, they discovered something alarming. It wasn't just their family suffering from these symptoms. More and more people were arriving with the exact same signs of illness. And then came the shock. The very same bus they had taken to the hospital was now parked outside the clinic. Every passenger was stumbling out, vomiting, and rushing inside. It was starting to feel like a real-life zombie apocalypse. Inside the tropical disease clinic, none of the doctors could figure out what was happening. They had no idea what this thing was or why people were deteriorating so quickly. But one young doctor began forming a theory. Many patients had skin that looked burned. Some had severe swelling. Others showed alarming changes in skin color. He was starting to suspect something. But if he voiced his theory to his superiors, he risked being laughed at. Still, he couldn't ignore it. He picked up the phone and called the higher authorities, explaining exactly what he thought was going on. September 28, 1987, in the office of medical physicist Dr. P. Monto, the phone rang. In fact, that day Dr. Monto received not one, but two highly unusual calls. The first call came from the health department, reporting that a woman had left a sack of scrap on a doctor's desk, claiming it was killing people. The second call was from the young doctor at the city's tropical disease clinic, saying he suspected his patients were falling victim to radiation exposure. Now, Dr. Monto might have dismissed one call, but two calls from the same city only hours apart? Something was definitely wrong in Goiânia. As soon as he hung up, Dr. Monto glanced out the fourth-floor window. Down below, chaos had erupted. People were screaming, abandoning their cars in the streets, running in every direction. Some carried children in their arms. Others struggled with loved ones slung over their shoulders. The sight sent a chill straight through him. With trembling hands, Dr. Monto picked up the phone again, this time calling the Goiânia State Environmental Department. He requested that a scientist be sent immediately to examine the sack of scrap metal. Dr. Monto's request was clear: find out what was happening in Goiânia. The Environmental Department assigned the case to a medical physicist named Dr. Walter Ferreira. His job was to investigate the strange sack of metal scrap lying in that government hospital. Dr. Ferreira gathered his instruments, hailed a taxi, and set off. On the way, he decided to test his radiation meter, just to make sure it was working. The moment he switched it on, the device's alarm began to scream. The needle jerked violently, as if it might leap right out of the gauge. Thinking the device must be faulty, Dr. Walter told the driver to turn back. He returned to his office and picked up a brand new radiation meter. This time, he switched it on the moment he stepped outside. And once again, the same result. The needle slammed to the far end, ready to burst off the scale. There could only be one explanation. The problem wasn't with the meter. Somewhere nearby, there was an enormous source of radiation. Some unknown force, something invisible, was constantly emitting ionizing radiation all around him. The realization made Dr. Walter's hands go cold. For a moment, he thought about abandoning the city and running far away. But he steadied himself. This was the job he had been assigned, and if he didn't do it, disaster would only grow worse. When Dr. Walter finally arrived at the government hospital, the sight nearly made him dizzy. Several fire trucks and ambulances were lined up outside. Here's what had happened. The doctor who had received the sack from Maria the day before had grown so nervous about it. he called in the emergency services. His instruction was simple: get rid of this sack immediately. The shocking part? The fire brigade was preparing to throw it into a nearby river. That would have been catastrophic. But before they could do anything, Dr. Walter arrived just in time and stopped them. He ordered, "Clear the entire area, right now. Evacuate the hospital immediately, or every single patient here will be carried out in a body bag." With the danger contained for the moment, Dr. Walter now had to answer two critical questions. What exactly was this radioactive source, and where had it come from? After a thorough investigation, he traced the trail back to Maria's husband's scrapyard, and from there to an abandoned radiotherapy clinic. When Dr. Walter arrived at the old building, the truth became clear. 2 years earlier, when the clinic had moved to a new location, one of their radiotherapy machines had been left behind, forgotten, abandoned. And that machine was the cause of the entire catastrophe. Inside it was an aluminum cylinder containing 93 grams of highly radioactive cesium chloride, a salt form of cesium-137, a dangerous radioactive isotope. If cobalt-60 was considered deadly, this was like meeting its grandfather. And now, it had slipped into the hands of thieves. For Dr. Walter, this was devastating news. In modern radiotherapy, cesium-137 is no longer used precisely because it is so dangerous. If mishandled or damaged, the consequences can be catastrophic. Cesium chloride dissolves easily in both water and air. In other words, cesium-137 has the potential to trigger a nuclear-level disaster. Its victims suffer and waste away like the living dead, but with no hope of survival. Walter immediately reported his findings to the higher authorities. When the Brazilian government heard the news, they were stunned. Within minutes, a nuclear emergency was declared in Goiânia. Thousands upon thousands of residents were herded onto buses like livestock and transported out of the city. One by one, the streets emptied. A haunting silence took over. The very first priority was clear. The parts of the radiotherapy machine had to be secured and disposed of by experts. The first priority was the sack sitting on that chair, but removing it directly was far too dangerous. So, using a crane, workers lowered a large sewage pipe over the sack, sealing it inside, chair and all, before filling the pipe with concrete. Across Guyana, chaos reigned. Scientists and experts poured in from every corner of Brazil. They were tasked with tracking down every possible source of nuclear radiation. Like hounds following an invisible scent, special vehicles equipped with radiation meters patrolled the city streets, searching for contamination hotspots. Even helicopters were deployed to assist in the hunt. The authorities converted an Olympic stadium into a massive testing center, where anyone suspected of radiation exposure could be identified and examined. A dedicated laboratory was set up to test both people and water supplies for contamination. And after days of relentless searching and inspections, some contaminated buildings were slowly dismantled, piece by piece. The debris from demolished houses and structures was loaded onto trucks and transported far outside the city. In total, 3,500 tons of cesium-contaminated waste was removed from Goiânia and buried deep in the ground, 15 kilometers away. Meanwhile, the stadium was filling like a scene from a nightmare. 100,000 people, moving like zombies, came to be tested. Of those, 1,000 were found to have been contaminated, and among them, 249 showed dangerously high radiation levels. Most cases involved contamination on the skin, but in some, it had entered the bloodstream. 20 of those people were so radioactive that even their urine and feces had to be treated as nuclear waste. By some miracle, most eventually recovered enough to live relatively normal lives, though the effects of radiation would haunt them forever. But not everyone was so lucky. One of the thieves, Wagner Pereira, had 2 fingers amputated. Roberto Alves, the man who had dismantled the device, lost his entire arm. One of Maria's workers, who had carried the sack to the hospital, suffered severe radiation burns across his back, a common symptom among those who had come into direct contact with the cesium. But for 4 people, there was no survival. All of them died within that same month. The most tragic death was that of a 6-year-old girl. She had not only smeared the glowing powder on her face, but had swallowed it while eating a sandwich. Her death on October 23, 1987, was slow, excruciating, and merciless. That same day, her aunt, Maria, the woman who had carried the sack to the hospital and first linked the scrap to the mysterious illnesses, also died. She was only 37 years old. The cause: massive internal bleeding from extreme radiation exposure. The remaining 2 victims who lost their lives were both workers from Maria's husband's scrapyard. They were scrapyard workers who had spent significant time around the radioactive isotope. It's said that their eyes turned completely black, like something out of a ghost story. The Goiânia nuclear incident left the city's people facing hardships that could never be forgotten. Just a year earlier, in 1986, the Chernobyl disaster had shaken the world, so public fear of nuclear accidents was already at an all-time high. This fear turned into prejudice. People from outside Goiânia refused to even speak to its residents, let alone meet them. Airline pilots refused to allow them on flights. Bus drivers wouldn't let them board. Landlords wouldn't rent them homes. And if that wasn't enough, businesses from other cities stopped buying goods from Goiânia merchants entirely, crippling the city's economy. From large companies to small shops, everyone suffered losses. Many went bankrupt overnight. The prejudice had reached such extremes that on the day the 6-year-old girl was to be buried, nearly 2,000 people rioted to stop it. No one wanted her laid to rest in their cemetery. In the end, it took the intervention of thousands of police officers to ensure her burial took place. For her, a special fiberglass coffin was built, painted with lead on the inside to contain the radiation. It is said that after she was buried there, no one has ever allowed a loved one to be interred in that cemetery again. She was the last, and the graveyard has remained abandoned ever since. The Goiânia incident is remembered as one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. The tragedy? It could have been prevented easily. The investigation revealed that the clinic's owner had indeed tried to remove the abandoned machine, but due to an ongoing legal dispute between the property owner and the company, he wasn't allowed to take it. Earlier, we spoke about the Cobalt-60 incident in Delhi, and strangely, it seems almost every radioactive disaster somehow has a scrap dealer involved. Even today, that cesium-137 waste remains sealed in concrete, still sitting on that broken chair, the same chair the doctor had once dismissed as holding nothing more than junk. He had no idea that what lay there would go on to destroy 70 buildings in Goiânia. The Goiânia disaster was not caused by war or by a terrorist attack, but by neglect ignorance, and a chain of small decisions that snowballed into catastrophe. It left scars that will never fade, on the land, on the survivors, and in the memory of an entire nation. It serves as a chilling reminder. Sometimes, the deadliest threats are the ones we can't see. If stories like this make you think twice about the hidden dangers in our world, don't let this be the last one you hear. Subscribe to Let's Discover for more true stories that history tried to forget. And ring the bell so you never miss what's coming next. Because sometimes the truth is more dangerous than fiction.